we're going to go ahead and move into the conversations with the author, Dr. Smith, at this time. Right after this, we'll move into the book signing. So if you have not had a chance to get a raffle ticket, make sure you get one. We want to make sure that you are a part of that. My name is Sean Patterson. I'm a doctoral student here at the University of South Florida, and I will be your host this evening. And I actually have the honor of working with Dr. Smith, serving as her research assistant. And as her research assistant, I have had the privilege of witnessing firsthand the depth of her commitment to challenging norms and pushing boundaries to understanding literacies in language. I'm honored to introduce Patriann, Dr. Patriann Smith, an accomplished author and 10-year associate professor here at the University of South Florida. And as a native of St. Lucia, Dr. Smith is widely recognized for her influential research exploring the influence of race, language, and immigration on literacy and teaching. Dr. Smith's work challenges conventional norms in global classroom, advocating for transdisciplinary approach, such as the transracial linguistic approach and her innovative framework, Black Immigrant Literacies. So guys, without further ado, please join me in welcoming the Dr. Patriann Smith. So before we actually get started and move into the conversations, we want to take a moment and just acknowledge some people in the room and just give them a book. So I will go ahead and let you do that, Dr. Smith.
All right. Good evening, everyone. We need a great Caribbean welcome. So good evening, everyone. I'm so happy that you're here and just so very proud of this moment where we can be together to celebrate this lovely book that has been a few years in the making. As Sean has mentioned, my wonderful research assistant, before we get started, we want to just acknowledge some of the key players in this lovely event. And our first person that would like to acknowledge this evening is Dr. Elizabeth Shaughnessy-Dedrick, Department Chair of LEAP. Dr. Shaughnessy-Dedrick is here with us, and we have a book for you, Dr. Shaughnessy-Dedrick, to receive on behalf of the College of Education here at USF. And so we would like to ask if you would kindly come forward and receive this lovely book on the college's behalf. Round of applause for Dr. Shaughnessy-Dedrick, everyone. Thank you. We also have a lovely president of the Caribbean Community Association in the house with us this evening, Ms. Evie Lamond, and she's now recently married, so she has taken on another name. But Ms. Lamond, can you come forward and receive a book on behalf of the Caribbean Community Association, where I served for about a year or two with this wonderful, wonderful group. Thank you so much for being here. We also have a book for Mr. Floyd Lewis, our amazing musician. Don't you all agree that the music was just amazing? Yes. He is a Caribbean native and just absolutely wonderful. We ask him every time we have events like this to come play. And so he has been here with us, and we just want to recognize Mr. Floyd Lewis. I'm not sure if he's in the room right now, but we will be giving him a free copy of the book as well. Our fourth person to acknowledge is Dr. Sandra Johnson Austin. I believe I saw her outside, and she's probably still out there, but we want to acknowledge her. And then Dr. Rachel Hatton and the Anshin Center for sponsoring this event. Congratulations, Dr. Rachel Hatton. Everything that you see here was co-sponsored by Dr. Hatton and also the Institute for Black Life. Rebecca is sitting right here representing the Institute for Black Life. You're very... And so I believe I've run out of my time for giving away books. And so just like to again, thank you all for being here. And thanks to the wonderful folks who've made this possible.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you all for being here as we celebrate Dr. Smith and this work, Black Immigrant Literacies, Intersections of Race, Language, and Culture in the Classroom. I have worked hand in hand with you for the past year or so, almost 2 years now. So I am very familiar with your book. But for those of you who are not familiar with your work, can you start off by giving us a brief overview of this book?
So where do I start? I think when I think about this book, one of the first things that comes to mind is just how I was impressed by these Caribbean students whom I had been working with to document their stories. And so this book is about stories. It's about Black immigrant stories, but more specifically, looking and zeroing in on Caribbean student stories and how invisible these stories have been to so many of us in classrooms. I particularly focus on Black immigrant students because race, language, and migration intersect in many ways for the students, but they often don't get the attention that they need in spaces where educational enterprises tend not to see these pieces that they bring to the table. And so my book really sort of gets at this notion of how do we address race, language, and migration. And it's based on the Black Immigrant Literacies framework that says, how can we do this by actually thinking about the ways that Black Caribbean immigrant students tend to be positioned when they get to the US. Many of the times they're positioned as being better than other Black students. And so I disrupt some of those notions that say, let's make them be what I call better Blacks. And let's think of them as individuals who experience racialization in nuanced ways, in different ways, but not often in ways that are similar to the Black American populations that they engage with. And so I kind of get at some of those tensions that have been in the field and existing, but have been sort of overlooked in how we talk about literacy research. The other part of what I do in my book, if you give me just one more minute, is I talk about what does that mean for literacy research and for literacy teaching? Literacy research has been focused a lot on monolingual, monocultural, monoracial sorts of norms. And I try to get us to think about how do we restructure curriculum, systems, educational enterprises in ways that censor the multilingual, multiracial, and multicultural assets that students present in the classrooms. So that kind of gives a sense of where I'm coming from with my book. Of course, there's a lot more complexity, but I think we can pause here for now.
So tell us, how did this work come to be? What was your motivation, your inspiration?
So my daughter is here. Shout out to Carice. She said, do not call me under any circumstances to the front of the room. So we'll just do a little wave to her. And my daughter in the back here, she went through the system as a child, being 5 years old when we came to the United States here in Florida, and really experienced a lot of the tensions that she was going through in school. So I watched her go through the system from elementary to middle school to high school. I also worked with students in a Caribbean student association for over 2 years. I call it scholar mothering because I was teaching them, but we were having fun playing all the music you hear outside and eating and cooking food together and getting together every month. And so there was a lot of that community building that I was doing with them. And they were telling me all these stories about loss, stories about abandonment, stories about loneliness, stories about psychological trauma. And I thought this is a very important moment to document what these students are experiencing and to make it more visible to the rest of us who may not know what it looks like. I too went through a lot in the academy as a Black immigrant scholar and student coming to the US. So I have my own stories that influenced me getting to this work. So if you ask me, I would say it's a multi-layered sort of coming to this place and seeing not just as a mother, but as a teacher and as a scholar, all the pieces intersecting together and wanting to say, let's do better. Let's make this something that we can focus on, but let's also make schools and educational systems more just.
Okay, thank you for that. So in this room, we not only have researchers, we have people from the community as well. So from a practicing standpoint, what are a few takeaways for practicing teachers in the field that could positively impact their everyday practice?
So I would say that my biggest articulation in the book is to think about how systems can use the assets that Black immigrants bring and can use that to change. So one of the big figures that I present in the book talks about metalinguistic metacultural, and meta-racial understanding. What does that really mean? It means that the Black Caribbean immigrant students, when they came to the US, they would think a lot about how they think about race while they were trying to navigate things in ways that they hadn't thought about before. They would think a lot about how they think about language in ways that they hadn't thought about before. And then they would also think a lot about how they think about culture in ways that they hadn't before. So these three types of understandings, I argue we can make them part of school systems and literacy that then allow us to democratize literacy in ways that other students who are from dominant populations can develop these assets, which they don't often present in ways that immigrants or Black students or students of color bring to the table. So I think for teachers to be able to use some of the frameworks that I present in terms of like the visuals and to change their standards. So I show, for instance, Dr. Russ, how can we take an English language arts standard that typically caters to a neutral student? We think in our minds of a neutral student. And what does it mean to change that standard? And what does it look like to use this framework to change that standard? So that when we do that, every child in the classroom is actually feeling like they can contribute and that they belong. And so that's one of the biggest, I think, contributions. It's not just looking at the child, it's looking at the systems and transformation in the systems.
Thank you. So as we continue our conversation tonight, I'm delighted that we have a few esteemed scholars who have graciously joined us today. So among them, one of them is Dr. Ramon Antonio Martinez, an associate professor at Stanford University who research focused on literacy learning among multilingual children and youth. So without further ado, Dr. Martinez, are you with us? I'm going to have you go ahead and unmute yourself and you can pose your question to Dr. Smith.
It's such an honor and a privilege to be here with you remotely. Again, I'm sorry that I can't be there in person, but it is really a privilege, Patriann, to be there, Dr. Smith, I should say, on this very exciting occasion. So I want to begin by congratulating you on what is, in my view, a beautifully written and powerfully framed scholarly intervention. So for the past 6 years, it has been my distinct privilege to know and learn from Dr. Smith, to engage with her groundbreaking scholarship, and to see her ideas develop into this very important and exciting book. So congrats to you on that. I know I was meant to pose a question, so I want to do that. And a key theme in your book is solidarity. And of course, there are different kinds of solidarity, right? Some more robust than others. I'm thinking, for example, of the distinction that Roseanne Liu and Savannah Shange articulate between thin solidarity and thick forms of solidarity. With the latter, thick solidarity involving the rejection of notions of shared suffering in favor of a focus on unique experiences with racism across different racialized communities. And it strikes me that your work elucidates the unique experiences of Black immigrant youth from the Caribbean, a growing population of students who, as you remind us, have been overlooked and invisibilized in the literature, and who have been misapprehended and misrepresented in everyday educational contexts across national borders. So my question is, given this, how do you think your work, Dr. Smith, can and should inform efforts towards building thick multiracial solidarity among Black immigrant youth from the Caribbean and immigrant youth from other racialized communities?
Thank you so much, Dr. Martinez. I cannot say just how pleased I am that you are here this evening. When I was just a student and an emerging scholar, Dr. Ramon was there from the very beginning. Let's just give him a round of applause for investing so much into me. With regards to the question, when I think about the thick solidarity that you mentioned, Dr. Ramon, I am thinking that one of the things in the book that I centralize is the voices of Black Caribbean students. And I think that for us to be able to build solidarity in these kinds of ways, we've got to be willing to resist the notion that there is one way of hearing the voices, or that there is one kind of voice that we are listening to. Case in point, there was a time when I was working with my daughter, for instance, And I asked her about how she felt about a particular issue around race. And she said, Mommy, I don't want to talk about race in relation to this right now. And I thought, there are voices that the students bring to the table around racialization, and we've got to be willing to hear what they're saying and not to impose our own experiences that we have on them, because they can tell us a lot about unique ways that they're experiencing racialization, but also how that intersects with the different kinds of languages that they bring to the table. So for instance, you have students who may be Black and Spanish speaking at the same time, experiencing even within that group very unique kinds of experiences that make contrast with Black Caribbean immigrant students from the English speaking territories. And so I think the idea is to be willing to allow ourselves to experience different ways of seeing how race, language, and migration intersect, and not to limit that to what we think it should look like and be. And then, of course, on the other side, to get into classrooms and into curriculum spaces and figure out how do we take that and infuse it into what we design our curriculum to be. And I think that's the ultimate question. How do we build the solidarity where our curriculum no longer focuses on just one population, which is a neutral, white, monolingual, monoracial population?
Well said. Thank you, Dr. Martinez, for that question. Now we also have the honor of welcoming another esteemed scholar, Dr. Tiffany Flowers, who serves as an assistant professor at the university, at Georgia State University. Dr. Flowers, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I think that this event is wonderful. Congratulations again, Dr. Smith, on your releasing a wonderful text. I can't wait to read it. I'm so excited. So I'm sitting here thinking about a lot of the conversations that we have one-on-one, Patriann, when we talk about teacher education and what's going on with Caribbean students and African-American students within schools. And I guess my question comes from a place of producing a teacher education space where I'm producing teachers to go out into the field, like many of us are. How do you envision your work being used across teacher education programs and eventually integrated into K-12 schools? Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. So the framework that I present, the Black Immigrant Literacies framework, one of the components that it includes is called holistic literacies. Holistic literacies from the perspective of how do we bridge dichotomies by thinking about one kind of literacy that we tend to focus on in classrooms or in teacher preparation programs. And what does it look like to allow teachers to see Black immigrant students bridging these boundaries in terms of the literacies that they present? What kinds of literacies are they bringing from these other spaces that may, be beyond the US? And how can teachers start seeing these other types of literacies as legitimate sorts of practices that they can incorporate into the curriculum? I think what happens with our teacher preparation programs is we tend to default to that monolingual, monocultural, monoracial norm in literacy research. As many of my colleagues will tell you, there is this sort of assumption that is not spoken, but it's there. It's underlying everything we do. And so I think for teacher preparation programs, the biggest shift that needs to be made, and I have articulated this in several spaces, is how do we get frameworks like Black immigrant literacies into the preparation program so that they are not siloed in one class, and that's the class where teachers take this information. It's got to be across the board. What does that look like for Dr. Hadley's here for vocabulary, right? What does it look like for the different areas that we consider to be foundational areas of literacy? What does it look like for us to transform our practice with a framework such as this? And how can we get deans and programs to be thinking in more concrete ways about doing that and making these changes? We're in Florida. I know I'm living a dream talking about this, but I think for me, I've never lost hope in terms of how we can be engaging in just practices that get us to actually honor the assets that students have and can bring to the table.
Thank you so much for providing that lens. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Flowers, for joining us. Lastly, I would like to welcome Dr. Vaughn Watson from Michigan State University. Dr. Watson, the stage is yours.
So I've just received a text from a lovely colleague, and he is not able to be there, Sean. But I have the question that he's asking, and I'm going to try to do justice to his question. He asked, Dr. Smith, thank you for your work and the invitation to engage and learn with your work and the communities in whom you have taught and learned. I'm very interested for myself and the audience in learning with your work and in the ways that you have deeply engaged with youth voices. And then thinking about how teachers and schools and communities can do this work. Returning to how educator and researcher communities learn with and extend authentic narratives, can you tell us about the necessary work of engaging with youth and youth voices, and also about how you foster solidarity? And I think I've answered this in part, but I just want to maybe talk about the youth voices piece. When you read the book, you'll notice that I have stories of the youth from the time they were young all the way into their adult college lives. I do that because I think in articles, we tend to have very limited space. And so the stories we present are often fragmented, and the youth voices, I call it that they get sanitized. So the youth voices are often erased, even in articles, even in journals, even in spaces where we are committed to doing the work. And so there are pages of authentic narratives of youth, their voices coming through, telling us who they are in their own words. And I think that legitimizes students in ways that allow us to bring to the table our own lenses, our own interpretations of who they are. And I think so that is one of the things I believe is necessary for solidarity building. If I tell my full story and you hear it and it touches you and your heart is breaking because of it, you're more likely to feel that empathy than if you read an article that is academic, that seems so far removed from your personal experience, and you're less likely to be able to connect with that. And so I think that the storytelling and the youth voices are going to be critical in terms of helping us to see each other as humans and getting beyond some of the hurdles that we continue to face.
Thank you. In just a moment, we're going to move into taking questions from the audience. But before we do that, Dr. Smith, would you mind sharing with us a brief excerpt from the book, something that you believe probably capture the essence?
Thank you so much. So can I be honest with y'all? I haven't chosen an excerpt. I started looking for an excerpt and I couldn't figure out which one to choose. But what I'll do is I'll tell you a little bit about one of the students that I worked with in this book. Her name is Chloe, and Chloe was a Jamaican, or she is a Jamaican student who had gone through basically being in Jamaica, but also being in the US. We call them transnational students, and moving back and forth with her mother from the US to Jamaica, and her mother then moved to Britain. So she also had some roots in Britain as well. Now, Chloe, what was interesting about her is that she was sort of biracial, but she identified as Black. So she had that added nuance. And a lot of her story was about not being able to fit into the Black American group or the Black African group or the white group in some cases. Like she didn't have a place where she could belong. And I thought, you know, this is a powerful indication of how students struggle, because when she talked about, you know, having to go to the therapy sessions, and I thought this needs to be a story that we tell. Not only was she placed in an ESL classroom where she didn't need to be for years, but she was also bullied that she moved 4 schools during middle school, bullied about her accent, bullied by students who were Black and brown like her, but also bullied by students who were white. And so you have a lot of these tensions that remain. She says the teachers never did anything about it. They never noticed it was even there. And so now that she's an adult looking back on a lot of this experience, she's able to talk about how the literacy practices that she developed, yes, they did come to get her to a school, a university, but at what cost? At what cost in terms of the brokenness of her identities and of the separation of her language from her personhood, at what cost? So I'm just going to read a little bit from Chloe here. Do you know the page number, Sean?
Page 41. I know it all by heart.
So Sean was very instrumental in helping with all of the references. So she has read this book over and over again. So Chloe says, my name is Chloe and I'm Jamaican American. I grew up in a family, and this is her authentic narrative that I mentioned earlier. I grew up in a family with my mom and sister. My mom always wants me to learn different languages. She put her money aside for me to go back to China, and she wants me to be fluent in Mandarin. I'm working on language all the time because she wants me to speak Spanish and Mandarin at the same time. She knows the whole of both. She knows Spanish, French, and something else. I got to the US when I was a baby. I would stay for school months and go back all summer and then come back for school and stay for the whole summer again. But the thing is, me and my sister, we have language problems because my mom had a very thick accent, like her family. So we started talking patois all the time. So then we had to take English classes all the way up to middle school. I was in an English as a second language class, but basically, like I feel I was speaking English, but you know, Jamaican, broken Jamaican. Kids bullied me and my sister all the time. I had a very good teacher though. She was very understanding and she knew my mom. This teacher was white, even though I went to an elementary school in East Dallas, which had a lot of Black kids and Hispanic kids. They're very different types, very diverse. But my teacher understood. She always worked with me on reading. For example, there was a program, Reading Rainbow, with the words. She would help me with the words because I would always spell it British, English British, like color, C-O-L-O-U-R. Like everything for me was British. So then she helped me a lot with that. And then I got to middle school. And then she talks about being in 5 middle schools. And then it gets very, very interesting. I'll just read one last excerpt for you if I have time, Sean.
You're good.
Okay. She says, I went to 5 middle schools, 5 different middle schools. In middle school, they pulled me out of the class in the middle of the day and said, oh, time for an hour of English. Okay, it was boring. I still remember how I did the keypad to spell out the words, and she said, no, that's not right. I fixed it, and still I got it wrong. And then I kept thinking, I'm gonna have to do it in a test. Then I still got it wrong. So it really wasn't helping me. I would be pulled out of class, getting the teacher's instruction, and still not getting any benefit out of the class. I would say my words, but then I started to say my words different from how I was writing. My speaking was changing, but my writing was not. Even today, I still spell color the same, and my professors don't say anything. So when I analyze, what I call analysis in my book, I talk about how I analyze this excerpt. I talk about just how there was a lot going on, right? So there was the immigration, but there was the racialization. There was what we call linguicism, right? All at the same time. She's going through multiple pieces where people are looking at her, seeing her and reading her in certain ways, but also hearing her in specific ways. And how does she actually grapple with that in terms of what it looks like on her literary practice? And what happens when teachers don't see that this is going on? So what I do is I present sort of a way of looking at this in classrooms, and then teachers can actually look at this and say, well, how do I actually make sure that I don't overlook a child like Chloe in my class? And that's really what it boils down to. And I present specific strategies that they can use to actually focus on that. So I hope you enjoyed Chloe's little excerpt because she's really dear to my heart. And, doing a lot of things now. But I think when we see a lot of Black immigrant students, we see them being so what we call successful, and we don't see their stories of grief and pain and trauma. And I think what I want to do is I want to say to us that every time we think of success for a Black immigrant student, there's always a story underlying that. And how do we try to make sure that those students who are babies, particularly the ones going through elementary, middle schools, they have somebody who can advocate for them. No, also in college too, because I think in college, a lot of our students get out there and they're still trying to find their way. And so how do we also become advocates for them at that time as well?
So can you tell, actually, no, I'm not asking questions. I'm going to open the floor and take questions from all of our guests here tonight. My friends online, feel free to ask questions if you would like as well. Raise your hand and Rebecca will let us know. But starting with online or on the floor, if anyone have any questions, just raise your hand or stand up and project your voice and we'll go from there.
We're also taking comments. So if you don't have a question, there we go, Dr. Russ. Oh, you can use this.
Good evening, I'm Dr. Russ. As a fellow educator, and in terms of the experiences that you've documented, and I feel like in the stories that are being told, there's also some student advocacy that has taken place. One of the things that I was wondering is how does your book, or how have the students learned how to teach? Whether it's the classroom or their environment, how do you teach others to understand that in a speaking accent is not a speech impediment?
What a powerful question, right? To just distinguish between the two and to think about some of the students that I worked with and how they were able to position themselves. I think that eventually Chloe found what she called a place where she could stay. It was the Caribbean Student Association. That's what happened eventually. And so I saw her doing a lot of that, trying to explain to her peers. And we were open to everyone. So it wasn't just Caribbean students. We also had white students. We had students who were Indian. We had students who were coming from different spaces, but wanted a place where they felt they belonged. And so I saw her making some of those moves in terms of trying to help folks understand, but also the informality, which is the holistic literacy piece, having music, having food, basically making meaning through music, through food, and helping folks to engage with some of the ways in which she sounded different without that judgment, making fun of each other in a way that sort of was like, this is what we do in the Caribbean. We have fun together. What does that actually look like in terms of humanizing her? So I don't think that she set out to necessarily do this, but I think it's part of the assets that tend to come forward if we make safe spaces for students to be able to share. It's so important to make those spaces too, because I think how else do we model to students who may not have the experiences what it feels like to be ostracized? In my book that's coming out next year, shameless plug in, Cambridge University Press, I talk about that very notion of peers actually setting out to do that in the Caribbean Student Association later on in that year. And what does it look like to be intentional about that process, but also for teachers to make these spaces for students? So I think this is the beginning part of that part of the work. And I really would like to extend it, because a transracial linguistic approach, which is right in this book, I show how students of color who are immigrant interact with dominant population students, and really showing how do we bridge those gaps. And that really is one of the essences of this book.
I just saw Dr. Watson come in, so I just want to say hi. Thank you for joining us. Any other questions?
Can I also make a huge shout out to Dr. Jennifer Schneider, my dissertation advisor, who is in the house, y'all. So
I have a question.
Dr. Schneider has been, I talk about her all the time, because had it not been for her, I would not have the voice today. When I came into the graduate school with my Blackness and my racialization that I was going through, she was the one who said to me, don't stop writing how you write. Don't stop speaking how you speak. And so I just want to honor you today, Dr. Schneider. I really appreciate you. Thank you so much for keeping me here. And I think she is an example of what I talked about earlier, an advocate who was willing to say, stay the course. And I think that had it not been for her, I was like packing my bag and heading back home. So thank you so much, Dr. Schneider. All right, Dr. Susan, are you?
Question about whether or not you have in your work looked at a question about parent advocacy. As a parent of some special needs child, needs loss, I was a total baby in that, but I wonder if I felt like I needed to advocate for my child. Have had experience with
That is such a good question. So I'm working right now on a book. I know, another shameless plug-in, on a book called African Immigrant Educators, basically getting experiences. And one of the pieces that we focus on directly is parents. I do focus on it also in this book, but it is towards the end where I provide parents with understandings about what the immigrant experience really is like. So if you go to the back of my book, Steve, you will notice, and Marcia, you will notice that I have a list of things that I tell immigrant parents that this is what people really mean when they're telling you these things. So, case in point, I came to the US second day, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and this woman at a school is telling me, I heard you all swinging trees back in the Caribbean like little monkeys. And I was like, oh no, we don't. We really we go to, and I'm explaining to her because I'm like, honestly thinking she doesn't know. And so I went through a lot of those kinds of experiences, but I will tell you that I honestly was just, okay, this is just them, not knowing. Well, I provide parents with a long list of things that you need to know contextually, historically about the US, because simple things like somebody might ask you about being in a restaurant and you're like, well, I didn't know that this was a restaurant considered in a certain way. There's just a lot of stuff you don't know about. And so in terms of advocacy, that translates into the school system as well. You have parents going into schools and not knowing their rights, not knowing what it is they need to be advocating for, or what does the legislation tell them they need to be able to do about their kids. And that's where I provide them with readings and resources and organizations they can tap into, really trying to steer them towards a path that gets them to think critically. I think a lot of the times we haven't thought critically as immigrant parents, myself being just one example, about what this looks like and how it disadvantages our students or our children.
A few of our guests have questions online, so I'm going to go ahead and invite them into the conversation. First, can I have Lasanya? Can you go ahead and unmute yourself and share your question?
I am unmuted. Good evening. Good morning. Good evening, Patriann, Dr. Smith. It's a pleasure to be here. My apologies, my colleague, that I am not able to be with you in person, but I am in there with you in spirit. I have a two-part question for you, Patriann. At the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned neutral scholars. Can you tell us a little bit about what you mean as it relates to neutral scholars or neutral students? And the second part of my question is, as it relates to the Black literacy framework, does the framework integrate how students can not only advocate for themselves within the school system, but how also can they advocate for themselves beyond those spectrums?
This is a good one, power packed, right? I would say that the neutral component, I use the word neutral and I don't use it in the book. What I use in the book is I say that there are assumptions that are made that are embedded in curriculum. These assumptions are always there. They are always there and they cater towards a certain kind of child. We do not say who that child is, but it's typically a child who belongs to what we think of in the US as a dominant group, which is typically white. But in other societies, I come from the Caribbean and we do the same thing. So I try not to make it about white or Black or white or people of color. And I say it's because of how the Eurocentric way of doing things has been embedded in all of the systems that we typically have grown up in. So in the Caribbean, my students talk about how they went through systems where the teachers would not let them use any kind of Creole or Patois in the classroom, and the mothers wanted them to speak properly all the time. And so when I say neutral here in this conversational space, what I'm trying to point to is that embedded assumption that is always present underlying the standards that we use to teach students. The ELA standards, the literacy standards, those assumptions are always there. Even in our universities, we have these standards as well for what it is we want students to sound like in order to make sure that they are legitimate. And so we impose our legitimacy on them based on how they can rise up to what we think of as that neutral norm. So I hope that that takes care of question one.
That helps. Thank you, Patriann.
And then for question two, I think the question there was about students becoming advocates for themselves beyond the school system. And I think that, yeah, sorry.
Within Patriann, within and beyond, because a lot of their situations are within.
Right. So advocacy within the school system, I would say, particularly for the students that I worked with, they struggled with being advocates for themselves within the system. A lot of our students from the Caribbean come with a more quiet sort of approach, and you tend to see them just absorbing. I was like that when I got to the US as well. Just very much absorbing and less vocal, but the US favors verbalization. The US favors people who speak out and who are what we call articulate. And the US wants that from you. As an immigrant student, if you tend to be more of that reserved sort of style, you're absorbing, you tend to be overlooked, right? And so you have that sort of situation where students have to be taught that they have assets. They have to be taught about the metalinguistic, metacultural, and metaracial assets that they possess. And then they've got to be taught how to position that. My daughter and I, we do a lot of that conversation, right? I'm like, did you go to the professor's office to talk to him about X, you know? And really sort of really helping them to take control over some of the narrative that is happening. For younger students, this is even more difficult, right? How do they have conversations with teachers about things that they don't even know about? And that's where I think parents' advocacy is so important. Parents standing in the gap for their children, but also parents who have been through that stuff before, acting as advocates and brokers for other parents and students who are coming through in the system.
So, that was great. And I really appreciate you elaborating on that. It really opens my eyes up to a lot of different things. Finally, if you could give us one nugget as higher ed professors and understanding that we prepare those teachers that go out and connect with these students, can you just give us one great nugget that if you had a takeaway to share with those practitioners that are coming out to work with our students that are from these varieties, cultures? What would you say to us and you desired us to share with those individual teachers to ensure that we know that these students may not advocate for themselves? What would you like us to share with our teachers or influence on our teachers to ensure that our students have someone, if they're not advocating for themselves, to teach our teachers to advocate for those students that may sit and feel voiceless?
Thank you so much for asking. So one of the elements in my framework is the local global connection. The local global connection is teachers actually being able to say what was the country of origin that the student came from and what happened there with literacy practice. What did teachers do there? What does it look like to be a student there? What does it look like culturally to be a student there? Having that particular heuristic that I provide in the book helps teachers to connect the global with the local, which is what is happening right here in the US right now. And so what students realize is eventually they can realize that back in the Caribbean, they may not have had the overt racism that they face here in the US, but a lot of it is embedded in the literate practice that they had back there. We're trying to show students that, yes, you're going through a tough time, but there are other ways that this tough time tends to be seen in your former country that you may not have been aware of. And then for teachers that, you know, we're sending out there, we want to help them to show students how to make these local global connections. Teachers need to be able to point to the assets that students are bringing from their homes, and then to show them what does that look like in comparison and contrast to what you're going with right now or going through right now in the United States. And really then providing them with that global understanding that positions them to not think of themselves as, oh, I'm just an immigrant, I'm trying to use my language. A lot of us have this sort of perspective that we're less than. We want to help teachers to help them see the power that they possess, and then to leverage that power in ways that become really life-changing for them and for the students that they engage with.
Thank you, Dr. Smith.
Thank you. Dr. Grant, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and share your question.
Hi, thank you for allowing me to speak. Congratulations, Dr. Smith. Hopefully I will get to meet you in person soon. So my question is multi-layered. I was an educator for a pretty long time. I'm in New York, and while in the class, I'm Jamaican immigrant as well, came here as an adult. In my role as an ENL teacher, formerly ESL teacher, teacher of English to speakers of other languages, I have taught students from Jamaica both informally and a little more formally in an ENL, formerly ESL classroom setting. And I've spoken with families as well. I also had a younger sister who experienced similar things to what your daughter experienced. She came here at 8 and it was in New York as well. So I see a bit of a continuum, and I see Dr. Chandel Nero here as well, who has done so much tremendous work in this field and who I actually cited in my own dissertation. I see a need for something that is tricky. One, somebody mentioned an accent is not a speech deficit. My sister and others have gone to speech and language class and had the language, speech and language out of them, right? And for some now, it can be seen as a special education situation, and that's why students are disproportionately placed in special ed. On the flip side, if we don't have policy for language support, then nothing happens. So it's a bit of a conundrum. Nothing happens really if people are not instructed or mandated to do so and given the funds. So with all that being said, what would you say is the best case scenario in terms of having official language policy for students from the Caribbean who may or may not benefit from ESL type structures, with the understanding that there's also some English exposure, with the understanding that some are bilingual, but some are monolingual, Jamaican, for example, not only Jamaican, I'm just using that as example speakers. What's the happy continuum to ensure that it's not a fly-by-night thing, that it won't end when the person leaves, and that it will be sustained? What are your thoughts on that? With the knowledge that money talks and policy makes people move. Thank you.
I'm so happy you asked that question, because the systemic part of my work, which comes out of the research of Dr. Jonathan, Rosa, and Nelson Flores, it's called a racial-linguistic perspective. This is where the emphasis points us to looking at both the institutional and the individual. I think for a long time, we've had a lot of what you described, Dr. Grant, the individual, right? Learning what do these individuals do? How do they, navigate race, language, and immigration? I'm so happy to see Dr. Nero is here. She is the forward writer for the book. And so really just being able to look at some of those intersections and to see that they are there is important individually, but also institutionally. I noticed recently that the US Department of Education talked about bilingualism as a superpower. And that, I thought, was a powerful indication of just decades of research asking us to begin to focus on policies that really look at some of the ways that we can transform schools and have mandates for teachers and principals and districts. And I think that was, Dr. Grant, one of the ways that I felt that we could potentially see this movement. I know that the Caribbean and Black immigrants tend to get lost in the shuffle, right? You may not always have policies that focus on every single group, but one of the things that I've been doing is trying to reposition what we tend to think of as dialects and trying to always make the argument that this is part of multilingualism, it's part of bilingualism. Why do we keep relegating it to what seems to be an inferior status dialect or Creole that then, in the case of Black Americans, in the case of Caribbean students, tends to make them seem subpar? So I think there are two answers to your question. And I think the first one is we are seeing some movement. We are finally seeing some movement with the policy orientation at a national level in the US. But we still have so much of a long way to go to get that equity across languages. And then number two, to think about just how do we reposition the conversation so that when we talk about bilingualism, we're not talking about a group of privileged students over here, but the majority world is bilingual. The majority world is multilingual. And so how do we incorporate all those dialects and creoles in what we think about when we talk about bilingualism and multilingualism?
I'm going to open it back up to the floor in a moment, but I'm going to take one last question for now online. And Dr. Shandell Nero, so glad to have you here with us. If you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes, I think I'm unmuted. Thank you. Of course, Dr. Smith, Patriann, big up to you. Congratulations. What a great book. I had the privilege of writing the foreword, so that was really an honor for me. I read every single word of it. Building off of my own work with the Caribbean population here in New York, I'm in New York City, and I'm an applied linguist, and I've studied the Caribbean population very much. And I think, Patriann, the thing that I really like and that you've raised is this intersectionality of race, language, and culture. And I think that really has to extend to teacher training because often, we go into schools and do professional development, but I'm just thinking, how are you thinking of getting this work out to the special ed teacher, to the speech pathologist, because all of the stakeholders in schools are affecting the children's language and literacy development. So that's one part. And I would offer a quick suggestion of one of the things I do is I teach a study abroad course in the Dominican Republic every year. And that is to take teachers to experience these cultures and talking about the local global connections. Because often teachers know nothing about the students they teach other than between 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock. And so how are we thinking about getting teachers to experience otherness, to put teachers to learn about difference as normal and not difference as exceptional? And so the question would be, how are you thinking of getting these ideas out to not just classroom teachers, but other stakeholders that impact our kids in the school system, administrators, and because all of these stakeholders need awareness raised about these intersections of language, culture, and race. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nero. And Dr. Nero is a Caribbean-born scholar. When I first started in the US, her work was just so powerful for me to start these conversations and to see her, just decades of work, Dr. Nero, that you've done in this area, paving the way for those of us who are currently doing the work. Thank you for that question. It's a big question. It's the kind of thing that keeps me up at night, right? What are you going to do next? I think that for me, one of the pieces that I've been looking at, Dr. Nero, is virtual reality. Virtual reality where I can position teachers into a space where they experience the kind of dissonance that our students go through. And they're able to sort of feel that tension and go through some of that and really be able to say, well, what is actually happening here? I think that I experienced the virtual reality moment when I was placed in a historical person's shoes, and I thought, wow, this is powerful. It really shifts your understanding. And so I think the study abroad piece is really great. but a lot of students may not have like the economic support, so may not be able to go out there. So how do we create opportunities for them to also experience this and to be able to feel? And I think I keep coming back to this feeling piece, because I think we often look at some of the teachers that we work with and we figure, how do I get them to feel what the student is feeling? I think we know that they know. We teach them all the strategies, but you can't make a person feel. And so I think that's where I worry about the work in terms of how do we get them to feel this? And like you said, with the study abroad, you can definitely tap into the feeling piece. But there are so many teachers who don't go abroad, and so many teachers who are just stable and they go out there, and a lot of them intentionally or unintentionally end up doing harm to these just beautiful lives. And I keep coming back to the lives, because these are children's lives that we work with, and not just a curriculum. It's like children's lives. How do we actually do this work and feel this work in a way that causes us to want to have that just approach, not because it's a strategy, but because it's who we are.
Thank you. Just let me add a coda to that, I take the teachers right here in engaging with immigrant communities here precisely because everyone can't go abroad, but we don't have to go abroad for Dominicans. We could just go to Washington Heights in New York City. And so one of the parts of teacher development is getting teachers to engage physically in the neighborhoods of where their kids live. And once I had an assignment where I asked teachers to go to their students' neighborhoods, and the first rule on the assignment is they could not drive there. And the teachers went crazy. Many of them lived in the suburbs. And they said, how am I going to get there then? And I said, take the New York subway. And I said, that's how your kids get to school every day. And that one experience of having them go in and not do the drive-by, but actually had to go into the community, engage in the community, go into the store, buy something. And if you don't speak the language, figure it out. And then they had to journal about that. So for students who can't go abroad, I have them go into immigrant communities right here in New York and structure activities around where their kids live, because they never actually go into the communities where their kids live. And so that's one way to avoid the cost of study abroad, to engage the communities right here.
I will be reaching out to you, Dr. Nero, to get some pathways for thinking more about getting out there, because I think that is the next step. We have so much knowledge. Louis Moll's work on funds of knowledge, we have so much information. I see that Dr. Alverman is here in the room, the great Dr. Alverman. Donna, can you say hello to us? There she is.
Yeah,
Hi.
hi.
Would you like to say some words? Donna is the series editor for this particular book. So we're so happy you're here.
Thank you very much. I was just typing you a message, a chat, so I will read from that if you don't mind, okay?
Okay, no worries
Dr.
at all.
Patriann Smith, thank you for arranging a time when those of us who cannot be there in person are able to share and feel a part of your book launch. Black Immigrant Literacies is a gift to educators worldwide. I admire your scholarship because it is theoretically rich, and you used it in that way when you offered the example of the young student, the young woman who you talked about when somebody asked you to give a favorite part of your book, and you said, I can't, but I'll give you this particular part. And one of the things that is so good about your work, and I've always admired, is that you think deeply and you research wisely, and then you're so giving. And I just want to say, we love you.
Oh, thank you. Let's give her a round of applause.
Okay, friends, we're going to go ahead and move into the raffle. So make sure you have your tickets. Do anyone need a ticket? Everyone have a ticket in the room? Okay, I'm going to give you the pleasure of pulling and calling out the numbers. Oh, wait. Un momento.
Anybody else?
Anyone else? Going once, going twice. There you go.
Yep. So we have 397678. Congratulations. All right, this one is close, 397679. Woo! Yes. So we have one more, that lucky person, 397693. Congratulations, everyone, on these wonderful winnings.
Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, friends online. We're going to go ahead and move into the book signing. So if you just want a book, please be sure to line up. There's also books for purchase out there. Dr. Smith, do you have any final words you want to say before we
Thank
dismiss?
you for coming, folks. Thank you for being here. Let's spread the word and silence invisibility.